first step is going to be to remove the bumper cover. First thing we do for removing the bumper cover is pull the grill out. Put your fingers through the grill and pull. Same thing on the other side. On this side, we just grab onto the grill, wiggle, get your fingers behind it, pull, and it's out. Now we're going to take out the bolts that hold the bumper cover in. The bolts go up from the bottom. They're an Allen socket. We're going to put our Allen into the bolt. Other side has the same bolt. Up with the Allen socket. Now we're going to pull the sides of the bumper cover off. They clip onto the bottom of the fender. What you do is push down and pull out. They come right off. Same thing on the other side. Same thing on this side. Push down, pull out, and it'll come loose. Now we're going to pull there's a bolt that goes through the bumper cover into the splash pan. One on each side. Small Torx. These tend to get ripped out. A lot of cars won't have them. Same bolt on this side, Small Torx. Now we're going to take the bumper cover and slide it forward. Once we wiggle it out a little bit, there's two connections you're going to have to disconnect here. One is going to be this black plastic clip. When you do this, windshield washer fluid is going to come out. We can set the cover down a little bit. I pull this hose and immediately fold it over and pinch it tight. That keeps us from losing too much of the fluid. Then I'll take a zip tie and I'll zip tie it into this tight position so that I can continue to work without losing any more washer fluid. If you have fog lights, you'll have to unplug them now. The way to unplug them is to take a small screwdriver, put it in this slot, push back. When you hear that click, it'll come right off. Same thing on both sides. Now we're going to take this bumper support off. There's 4 bolts that hold the bumper support on. 1, 2, 3, 4. Take them right off and spin them out. With the bolts out, the support comes right off. Set it aside. We're going to pull the 4 bolts on this side. Yours may have only 3. Some have a bolt here, some don't. On this support, this small 10mm nut right there is going to hold the support to the front of the car. That's okay, you leave that nut on, there's no reason to take it apart any further. we're going to do here is take one of the bolts that held the bumper on. We're going to put that bolt through here and thread it in. What that's going to do is it's going to be a guide when we slide the nose forward to give us enough room to work on the timing belt. I'm going to put one on this side and the same thing on the other side. Again, one of the bolts that held the bumper on, thread it through the radiator support into the subframe. You don't need to have it tight, just get some threads on it. That'll allow us to slide the nose forward and rest on this bolt when we get to that point. Now we're going to pull the bolts on the top that hold the radiator support to the car. 2 Torx bolts here. Pull those right out. You have a 3rd bolt here where the fender bolts to the radiator support. Then we go and do the same thing on the other side. On this side, same thing, 2 bolts. That's the top. Right here, this bolt on the side. Now we're going to take these 2 screws out that hold the air intake on. Cap off, that'll make it so there isn't a vacuum in the cooling system. Once the radiator cap is off, turn this screw out. In this case, it looks like the drain is plugged slightly, so we're going to pull the cap a little further. You're going to let this drain until it's completely empty. Now we can slide the nose forward. That'll give us enough room to work on it. We can leave it right there. What I'm going to do is go ahead and take this whole nose piece off so that you can see what I'm doing on the front of the engine a little bit better. But all you need to do is get to this point, slide the nose forward, and then you can fit your hands down inside in order to be able to work on everything. Now to drain the rest of the coolant out of the engine so when we take the water pump off it doesn't splash, we're going to take this drain plug right here out. It's on the bottom of the water pump housing, right on the bottom of the water pump. Pop that out, it'll drain the rest of the coolant out, and then you won't spill any more during the rest of the job. I've slid the nose all the way off the car, moved it over so that you can see what I'm doing in here. Next step is going to be to remove the cooling fan. There are 4 small Allen bolts that hold it on. Get your ratchet in there, spin the fan, break it loose. Sometimes the fans stick on. This one popped off pretty easy. If it sticks on, just grab it at two opposing sides and pull. It'll pop off. Now we're going to take off the water pump pulley. First thing you want to do is look in these holes. Sometimes these get filled up with dirt. If they do, you won't be able to get the socket in all the way, and if you don't get the socket in, you'll strip the bolt. Make sure your socket is seated firmly. Take your hand and pinch the water pump belt like that. That'll hold it in place and allow you to break the bolts loose. Loosen them up one at a time. Break them loose, and then once they're loose, you can remove all three. Now just pull all three of them out. The pulley will come apart in two pieces. Take both pieces of the pulley off. We're all set. Be to remove the AC belt. We do that by loosening these two bolts on the air conditioning tensioner. I normally replace this tensioner. You can see that this pulley right here has just a little bit of play in it. They're a pain to get out later, and they're easy to do now, so I'll take both these bolts right out, take that tensioner and belt, and throw them out. I won't reuse them. Now we're going to remove the serpentine belt. We do this by putting a 17mm wrench on the tensioner. Pull the tensioner over. That releases the tension on the belt. Take the belt off. Again, this is another belt that I replace whenever I'm doing a timing belt, so we'll get rid of that. Now I'm going to remove the serpentine belt tensioner. You need to do that to be able to get the timing cover off. This is another part that I generally replace. So I'm going to discard this and put a new one on. Now we're going to take the coolant crossover hose up. There's just enough room in this hose to get it up over the valve cover. Should be enough room in this hose also. This one's been replaced, so it's not the original. We move it out of the way. Now we're going to take the timing cover off. There are two metal clips on the top of the timing cover that hold it to the valve cover. One there, one right here. Pop those metal clips, wiggle the cover. Move that out of the way. Now we can set the car to top dead center, and I'll show you how to do that. There's a mark on the timing cover, a small triangle right there. Then there's going to be a mark on the crankshaft. We'll bring it up till we see the notch on the harmonic balancer. Now we need to look, once we have those lined up, we need to come up here and look at the camshaft. Right now, our marks are 180 degrees out. This timing mark is down here. It needs to be up here lined up with this. So we're going to spin the bottom of the engine over 360 degrees. That'll move the larger camshaft gear 180 degrees and line our timing marks up here. We're now at top dead center. This mark on the valve cover is lined up with this mark on the camshaft pulley, and then down here our marks are lined up. This mark is not always accurate. I do not trust this to be the total top dead center. I'll show you how to verify top dead center once we have everything apart. Now I'm going to remove the harmonic balancer. There's 4 Allen bolts that hold the balancer on. One of the things I always do is take a pick, scratch around in there. These really tend to fill up with dirt. These are very clean right now, but they tend to fill up with dirt. That makes it more likely that you're going to strip these coming out. So clean them up first. Make sure the socket's all the way in. The engine will move over when you do this. That's okay. That one's already starting to strip. What we're going to do is go over how to take them out when they start to strip like that. Okay, if these start to strip, which is fairly common, the first thing we're going to do is take our Allen socket, tap it in there, give it some taps. That should hopefully loosen it up a little bit. Put the ratchet in, push in on the ratchet while you try and twist. Still didn't get it out. That happens pretty often on these, so I'll have to go to the next step. What I'll do now is try and get the other ones out, see how many of them do come out. Three came out. This one's still stripped and giving us a hard time. First thing I'll do is try a newer socket of the same size. Tap it in, check and make sure that your socket isn't worn. If it's worn off on the ends, it's going to be more likely to strip. Tap it in there, push in as you turn. Same thing, spins right out. What we do is we take a torque socket that doesn't fit in there, just barely. Now we're going to take that torque socket and we're going to tap it in. It's not going to fit in square the first time, and it may take a few attempts at this to get it to break loose. Same thing, push in, try and turn. It popped out. That's okay. We're just going to keep tapping it in there until we get it seated all the way and it breaks loose. This is the easiest way to do them when they strip. There we go. Broke loose. We'll spin it out. You can reuse this bolt if you have to, if you don't have access to any more. It's not a bad idea to have a few of these laying around when you're doing timing belts so you can replace them later. This bolt's out. I'm going to put it back in just long enough to re-verify top dead center. The reason we check this multiple times is we need to know before we take the car apart if top dead center was correct. If this mark and this mark were lined up, we'll have to check it 3 or 4 times as we go. We need to be very careful about that. Okay, we're back up to top dead center. We've checked both of our marks again. Taken all 4 bolts out. Now the balancer itself comes off. Should be able to just wiggle and it'll pop right out. Next, we take off the timing cover. There are 4 bolts that hold the lower timing cover on. 2 10mm bolts, one here, 2 Allen bolts. We'll do the 10mm first. One of them is tucked behind the fan clutch a little bit, but you can get to it. One. Helps if you put the socket on the nut, then put the extension in the socket. Okay, now we're at the timing belt. What we're going to do is I'll show you how to verify top dead center, then we'll take the timing belt off, we'll take the water pump out, replace those components, and start putting it back together. Now, in order to verify top dead center, I don't trust the marks that are on the timing cover of their harmonic balancer, so what I do, I'm going to pull the #1 spark plug coil. This engine is an ATW. AEB looks slightly different, but the bolts are in the same place. So we take the 2 Allen bolts out of the coil. We're going to lift the coil up and move it out of the way. Usually if the wire harness is original, we can just slide it up and over. Now we're going to pull the #1 spark plug. One of the things I always do is check for oil on this part of the plug here. If there's oil here, that indicates a leaking valve cover gasket. This one looks pretty good. Now, in order to verify top dead center, I use a long quarter drive extension. I put it down through the spark plug hole. That lets it sit on top of the #1 piston. While that's there, I can move the crank back and forth. And when the piston is at top dead center, that will stop moving up. When it is at its highest point, that means the piston is at top dead center. Then I just verify my marks here are lined up on the cam, so I know that my marks down here are okay. I'll leave this like this so that I can double check top dead center when I put the timing belt back on. I trust this more than I trust the marks that come on the car. First thing I'm going to do is remove the timing belt tensioner. 2 bolts, one here, one here. The whole tensioner is going to come off. That'll allow me to get enough slack in the timing belt to be able to take the timing belt off also. Once the tensioner is off, we now have enough slack in the timing belt. Should be able to slide it off with the pulleys. Timing belt's off. The tensioner and the timing belt go in the trash. We replace those. On the ATW and AEB, the oil pump is driven by this pulley right here. There's a shaft that goes back and drives the oil pump. We need to get this pulley off in order to take the water pump off. You definitely should be doing the water pump at this time. What we'll do is we'll put a socket on this. Then I just use a screwdriver against this bolt in here to block the pulley from spinning. Okay, we're going to start taking the water pump off now. First thing we're going to do is move this bracket out of the way so we can get to the lower water pump bolts. This nut here gets loosened. Doesn't have to come all the way out. We just need to loosen it so that we can move the arm. This bolt that supports the power steering pump comes all the way off. Once it's loose, we should be able to just push it down. That ought to give us enough room to be able to get the bolts out of the water pump. Now we're going to remove the water pump. There are 8 bolts that hold the water pump on. 2 of them are back up here where you can't really see them, but you'll be able to get to them pretty easy. Once you have all 8 of these bolts out, put your drain pan back underneath the water pump. Since we drained it all the way, no coolant should come out when we pull the water pump, but you never know. Better than making a mess on the floor. There's all 8. You can expect that the gasket is going to hold the water pump on there pretty good, and you're going to have to tap it a couple times to get it loose. With all the bolts out of the water pump, I'm just going to take a small hammer and tap it right here. That'll knock it loose. Discard the water pump. We always want to put a new one of these on. This car hasn't been done before, so it still has the factory gasket behind the water pump, which is a metal shim gasket with a rubber insert in it. All we're going to do is take a small screwdriver, wedge it in there, try and pry that metal shim off, like so. Once we can get our fingers behind it, we'll pull. Then we just take a razor blade, we'll run around and scrape all of this clean so that we have a good sealing surface for the new gasket. Now we're going to remove what's commonly called the relay roller. One bolt holds this on. Spin the bolt out. You're going to discard this relay roller. This is a common failure part, so you don't want it in your car. Now we're going to start putting it back together. The first thing we're going to do is put the water pump in. I take the gasket, place the gasket on the water pump. One of the things you want to check is that your water pump has a metal impeller. Some aftermarket pumps have a plastic impeller here. The plastic impeller tends to fail, so you want to make sure that yours is metal. I'm going to slide the pump into place. Make sure the gasket stays fairly lined up. Now once the pump is in place, I'm going to start every single bolt before I tighten any of them down. So I'll go all the way around. I'll put all the bolts in by hand, and I'll look in each hole as I go and make sure that the gasket is in place. Once I have all the bolts started by hand, I'll go ahead and tighten them down to spec, and then we're ready to move on. Now we're going to take the nut and the bolt that hold the power steering pump support bracket on and put those in. Now we're going to put the pulley for the oil pump drive shaft back on. This cannot be installed backwards. It doesn't fit. There's a key here, a keyway in the shaft. Line them up. And again, it doesn't matter where this sits. It isn't timed to the other components. We're going to put our bolt in. Same as before. We'll use a screwdriver to hold it in place. We'll tighten it down to spec. Now we're going to thread the relay roller in. It goes into the cylinder head. Line it up, thread the bolt in, and then tighten it down to spec. Now we're going to put the tensioner in place. Tensioner goes here. Wiggle the relay out of the way, start both bolts, then once they're both started, we'll tighten them down to spec. The way the system works is the tensioner pushes up on this arm, moves this out on the eccentric. That's what tightens the belt. In order to give myself a little more room when I'm putting the tensioner and the belt together, I loosen this bolt right here enough so that the arm slides out so that I can move this pulley in a little bit and the tensioner is separate from it. That gives me enough space so that I don't have to push so hard while I'm putting the belt on. What I've ended up doing is taking the arm all the way off on this one. The belt's a little tight, so it's going to make it a lot easier to put on. I'm going to start by putting the belt at the top. I can see that my pulley up here is at top dead center. The marks are lined up. We'll put it around the tensioner. Hold the belt with this hand pulled down. And we want to have this part of the belt as tight as we can. Then we slide the belt over the oil pump pulley, which can be moved to make it easier. Right there. Now what we'll do is put this arm back on so there's a little tension on it. We'll spin it over a few times, double check all of our top dead centers, make sure we're good to go. I'm going to put the tensioner arm back on. To do that, I'm going to put an Allen wrench in the relay roller. We'll tighten that back up. That'll make it so we can spin the engine over. With the pin still in place on the tensioner, we're going to spin the engine over twice. There's enough tension on the belt so it's not going to skip. What we're going to look for is we're going to verify our top dead center comes back up correct here. And we're going to use our extension to verify the crankshaft is at top dead center also. You need to make 2 complete revolutions of the crankshaft to get 1 complete revolution of the timing belt. Okay, all the way up on top dead center with the piston. Our marks are lined up here on the camshaft. That means our camshaft is where it needs to be. Now we're going to pull the pin. That allows the tensioner to expand. That'll take up the slack in the belt. Before we put any covers back on, we're going to go through, check every bolt that we had off in here. the bolt for the oil pump, the bolts for the tensioner, the bolts that hold the relay roller on, the bolt that holds the arm on. Once we know they're all tight, we can start putting the covers back on. Okay, now we're going to put the lower timing cover on. When we put the lower timing cover on, two of the bolts are very important. They go through this front seal cover. If you don't put these two bolts in the lower timing cover, you're going to have a bad oil leak. So we'll line the timing cover up, put it on. It's this Allen bolt right here and the 10mm headed bolt that goes here are the two most important ones. Of course you need all of them, but if you forget these two, you're going to have a bad oil leak and have to take it all the way apart again. Again, with this nut that goes on the top one, sometimes it helps to put the socket on the nut first, then the extension in the socket. It's just a little off-centered. That gives you a little wiggle room to put it together. Okay, now we're going to move on to the upper timing cover. Okay, pins pulled. We've checked all of our bolts. Lower cover's on and tight. We're going to put the upper cover on. They kind of slide together and join right here. This is the hardest part of getting this cover on, is making sure all of these pieces are lined up. Once you've got it set, you'll be able to clip it in. See, this is nice and tight. There's no gaps in it, so now we'll push it in on the top, put our little metal clips on. We can roll our hoses over and put them back into place. Now we're going to start putting the belts back on. And we're going to put the harmonic balancer back on. There are 5 holes in the balancer itself, 4 bolt holes, and this pin right here. So we line the 5th hole up with the pin, wiggle it, and it'll go together. You may have to wiggle it back and forth a little bit to get the bolts started. I've replaced the bolts that we had a hard time getting out with other bolts that were in better shape. Don't tighten any of them down until you get all 4 of them started. Even with all 4 of them in, there's some play in there. That's one of the reasons I don't trust that mark. Now you can go ahead and tighten all 4 of these down. Now we're going to put the serpentine belt tensioner on. What we'll do is start all 3 of these bolts before we tighten any down. Once they're all started, we just run them right in. Now we're going to put the serpentine belt on. Start at the bottom. You got to kind of wiggle it in behind the bracket for the AC compressor. Around the tensioner, up around the alternator. It's going to come around the other side of the fan pulley. Once you've got it pretty close to lined up, take your wrench, take the tension off the tensioner. That should give you enough room to get it lined up all the way around. Once it's on, check, make sure it's all the way around the lower pulley. Power steering pump pulley, alternator, let go of the tension, that belt's on. Now we're going to put the AC belt back on, put it around the AC first, then around the harmonic balancer. We're going to install the tensioner. Tensioner is the 2 bolts that hold it on. One right here. One right here. We're just going to snug these bolts up, then we'll tension the belt. Now we're going to tension the belt. The way we do that, we can put our 17mm wrench here, push down. You don't want it to be too tight. You should be able to turn that about 90 degrees in the middle. Be on the tight side with this. It's tough to tighten up if it's too loose. The belt will squeal a lot, make a lot of noise when the AC is on if it's not tight enough. Tighten down both bolts, and we're all set with that. Now we're going to put the water pump drive belt on. What we do is put the inside pulley on first so that our bolt holes line up. And we're going to put the belt over the power steering and let the belt sit. What tightens this belt is the tension of the pulley. So we're going to start away from the belt over here. We'll get this bolt started. Then once this one's started, we're going to spin it, start the next one, spin it, start the last one, and then we can tighten all 3 of them down. Once all 3 are snugged, same as when it came off, we'll pinch the belt between our fingers and tighten them down. We're going to put the 4 bolts back in the fan, put the fan back on the fan clutch. Again, get all 4 started before you tighten any of them down. While we're working on the fan, you always want to look at it, make sure there's no cracks around the outer ring or any of the blades. If it's cracked anywhere, throw it out, get a new one. When they break, and they do break, it will damage the radiator. Okay. Now we're going to start putting the nose back in place. You're going to have to push in with your body. What we're going to do is start all of the bolts on the nose, and then once they're started, we'll go back and tighten everything. You've got 2 on top here, same 2 on the other side. And then 1 on the side down here. You always want to check and make sure before you put any bolts in that the fender's on the correct side of the nose. You may have to lift the nose, wiggle it a little bit to get things lined up. And again, before we tighten these, we're going to put them all in, so we'll go do the same on the other side. On this side, we'll do the same thing, push it in with our body. We'll get them started. 3 on this side, 2 on the top. One on the side underneath the headlight. Before we tighten these, we're going to put the bumper supports on. Okay, now we're going to put the bumper support back in, slide it in place. We're going to start the bolts that hold the bumper support. Once we get these 3 started, we'll go ahead and take out the bumper bolt that we threaded through to support the nose. We won't need it anymore once these bolts are started. We're not going to tighten these down until everything's in place. Now we'll go do the same thing on the other side. Okay, same thing on this side. I'm going to get all these started before we start to tighten any down. We can take out the bumper bolt. Now that they're all started, we can go back and tighten them all up. Okay, now we're going to slide the bumper cover back on. The first step is going to be to plug in the fog light. If your car is equipped, 1 on each side. Helps to have an assistant holding the other side of the bumper as you do this. The next step is going to be to reconnect the headlight washers. We're going to put this hose together. We'll put the black clip back on the hose. That holds them together. Once they're clicked, we can take our zip tie off. Now our headlight washers will work. We're just going to lift the bumper up into place, slide it back while lining it up with the bumper mounts. Pull it out a little bit so it pushes all the way back. We're all set there. I'll show you how to click them back on. Okay. Got the bumper cover pushed back. It's not clipped on. First we're going to put the bolts back in. You can put your finger up here, feel the hole, wiggle the bolt around, it should go almost all the way up like that before it engages the threads. Once it engages, you can go ahead and tighten this down. You don't have to get the other one started before you tighten this down. Same thing on this side. Reach up with your finger. You can feel the hole. Should be able to wiggle it. Feed it almost all the way through before you need to start threading it. Go ahead and tighten it down. Okay, bolts are back in the bumper cover. Now we're going to put it in. What we do, lift it up so it's lined up. Once it's lined up, give it a couple of good smacks. Tug it a few times. That's staying in there. We're all set. We'll do the same thing on the other side. Same thing on this side. Get it so it's lined up. That's it. Give it a couple tugs. It's in there. We're all set. Now we just put the two bolts in from the back side. Those are the first ones we took out, and we're done with the bumper cover. Now we put the grills back in. All we do is start it on the inside, push it in until it clicks. It'll click in place. Once it's in there, you're all set. Same thing on the other side. Same thing on this side. Start the grill in, give it a push, and it just kind of clicks into place once it's in there. All done. Okay, we've got the coil and spark plug back in. Now we're going to put the intake in. The intake slides in from the side. Got to kind of wiggle it to get it lined up. Clip it onto the air box first, then you can use your fingers from the front to line up the two screws. Get them both started, then tighten them down. The only thing that's left is to make sure all of your drains are tightened up so the coolant doesn't run back out of it. Top it off with coolant. Bleed it. Let it get up to temperature. Check the coolant level again. You're all set.